In this video, we're going to talk about the idea of selecting parts of our image. The reason that's important is because compared with vector programs where you can just click on a square and move it, or click on a square and change its color, you have to select areas of your program before you can do that. Select part of your image before you can do that. So we're going to spend this entire video just on how to select different parts of your image. There's a good half dozen ways or tools that they give you to select, and we're going to kind of go over each of those here. The first one is just this rectangular select. It draws a rectangle and it will create a rectangular selection. I'm going to kind of combine this tool with the one beside it, the circular selection. It's technically called an elliptical because it's more of an oval shape unless you make it round. And you can modify your selection. Once you draw it, you can use these handles, these four handles, to change your minds or to adjust it. So if you draw that and you missed it a little bit, you can move it back or move it down a little bit, and that's very, very helpful. And before I go on, let me just kind of talk about what it means to select an object and how it affects the way you work. If something is selected, you cannot do anything to another part of the image while that's selected. So if I take the paintbrush here and just start painting away, you'll notice that it automatically stops at the edge where it's selected. If I wanted to blur my image, so I'm going to go to blur, it's only going to blur the selected image. So and I think everybody understands that, but just make sure, what happens a lot is you may actually click on your mouse and select some corner of your image by accident, and then you come up here trying to blur and nothing is blurring. It's because you still have a little selection. If you ever get confused, go to select none. It's Control-Shift-A. If you want to remember that, it's also helpful to remember the shortcut. Just think Control-A to select all, but just add the Shift key, and that will deselect everything so that you don't have to worry about what was selected. Now, when you select something, the first option to this command, each of these have additional things you can change with this option or with this feature, is the idea of adding or subtracting to the selection. Many times it's very difficult to get a very, very intricate selection the very first time. Maybe it's a skyscraper or an entire skyline of a city, and you have to select each of the buildings. Well, what you can do is you can do a basic selection and then click this little addition option right here. This is under tool options, and then when you draw, it actually adds that to the original selection. There's also a subtraction here, so if I click on that one, it will take that part out of my selection. And if you recall, this actually mirrors the same options we had under vector with the shapes command, where we could add or subtract shapes together to make new shapes. This is the same feature, except it applies to selecting, not just making shapes. Although if you go up here to edit fill, you technically get that shape because we have created a selection, and then when you fill it with a color, you get that shape. So in that regard, it is very similar. So just be aware this option normally is on replace, which means when you start a new shape, it's going to replace the old shape, but just be aware that you can subtract. There's also an intersect. I rarely use intersect, so I'm not going to bother with that, but it works just like what we learned in the last program as well. So that is the addition, subtraction, and replace of selection. So just be aware of how you do that. And of course, remember the select all and the select none. Another option here is to invert. Maybe what I want to change is everything but the eye. So if I select the eye here, just approximately, I'm not going to be very precise. Notice that, and it's going to be very tricky to notice here, that right now the little, what they call marching ants around that selection is around the eye. Now if I go up here to select invert, it looks almost exactly the same, except notice now around the outside of my image, they're also marching, which basically means that the area that's selected is not the eye, but everything but the eye. And the way you can easily see that is, let's just maybe do a blur or something. You can see that everything except for the eye gets selected. So sometimes it's actually much, much faster to select everything you don't want to change and then do an invert. So that is three common features under select is all, none, and invert. So just be aware of those features there. The next feature I want to mention is when you have a selection, by default it is very, it's a straight line, meaning that when I paint up to it, it stops right on that line. Sometimes you're going to want to feather the selection. And just like we talked about feathering the brush, it has the same effect. Under the select menu, you can go to feather, and you can specify how many pixels. Now, this is always relative to how big your image is. If you're dealing with a very small image, 5 pixels may be enough. In a very large image like this one, I may need 25 pixels. And let me just show you what it does. When you hit OK, nothing actually happens. But now when I paint, it actually goes outside of that line by 25 pixels, fading to transparency. So when you feather, you say, don't make it the exact selection. Let me go outside the line just a little bit. So that gives you a little bit of a fade on your selection. Sometimes it's just too abrupt to select, an eye here and maybe change the color or something. Maybe it's too abrupt so we want to feather it. That also applies to any effects that you apply to it. So if I feather it, we'll do it by, let's say 50. And then we apply an effect like blur. It's going to filter that blur out. So it's not just a straight line where it stops blurring. It fades the blur out. So that is the idea of feathering. So I want you to know that term. Another option is to grow and shrink the selection. And just like it sounds, if I shrink it, I can take off 2 pixels at a time, 5 pixels at a time, whatever and I grow. I can do 35 or 30. Now you could use this for actual, let's fill a circle here with a color. Now without changing anything, I'm going to shrink my selection, let's say by 3, and then if I pick a different color and fill it now, and let's just do it, let's shrink it maybe by 10 this time so you can really see the difference. Pick a different color, and you can create kind of borders, and you can kind of see the black border. That was only a 3 pixel border because I shrunk it 3, and then I shrunk it a little bit more with the red, and whatever's left over is the green part. So you can actually use that. And that's very helpful when you have a very maybe it's round and you need to just make that a little bit larger. A lot of times we're going to get to a command later on where you've outlined a shape, but it's just a little bit too close. So you want to expand that, and you want to grow that selection just a little bit. So grow maybe by 3 pixels, and it just goes out a little bit larger. Another thing that we're going to use is the idea of creating a border to something. Maybe you have a selection here and you want to create a quick frame. You can go to select border and let's do a 10-point border, and it will actually shrink and grow at the same time. And that way when you paint it or fill it with a color, you can see the inside's no longer selected. It's just where that line was, plus or minus the number of pixels I told it to. So that's going to be a border, and that's going to be, we'll use that too from time to time. Another feature here, this is going to be kind of dangerous to use this command, or not dangerous, but it can be frustrating if you forget you're using the command. Sometimes when you're painting and you have a selection, you want to see what it looks like. Let's do a quick example of that. Let me select the eye here, and I want to see what this eye looks like. And I'm just going to change the color of the eye. Let me go back to the master here. And so I have the eye color. Now, right now, I have that dotted line, that marching ant surrounding it, and you really can't see how it transitions to the rest of the document. So if I hit Control T, and of course mine is not going to, there it goes. If you hit Control T, that eye is still selected, but I'm hiding those lines, so I can't see it. So it shows me exactly how it transitions into the surrounding object, the surrounding image. But what's frustrating, the reason I said it was dangerous, is because if you go to paint somewhere or change something else, you'll find you grab your paintbrush and it won't let you paint anywhere. It's because the eye is still selected. So hit the Control T again to turn that back on. Another example, another use, let me hit undo real quick here, and just to kind of show you why we use that addition. If I come over here, I may want to select this eye in a completely different shape, but because I have the addition on, it's going to do both of those at the same time. So if I want to change the color, now they change together. So I want to mention kind of a practical reason why, when I was changing the eye color, a practical use of that add or subtract is just to have two different parts of the image selected at the same time. I meant to mention that earlier. So just be aware that you can hide a selection, but just remember to turn it back on, otherwise it will be very frustrating. That is the main options I want to talk about with as far as changes to these features, but let me go on. There's actually 4 or 5 other shapes and ways you can select. One is called the lasso tool. I say lasso tool in Gimp, they call it free select. The Photoshop name, and a lot of times I kind of go back and forth between the Gimp term and the Photoshop term. It's kind of good to know both because most people in the real world use Photoshop, so if you use just these Gimp terms, sometimes they won't know what you're talking about. But the free select or the lasso, it actually looks like a lasso here as well, so that helps you kind of remember. That allows you to draw your own selection. So maybe a circle, maybe I'm not looking for a square or an ellipse, so I want to draw my own selection. Just be aware that when you stop drawing, please make sure you double click so it completes the selection. Now you have that marching ant, you know it's selected. Another problem that students run into is always remember that when you draw and you double click, it will always go back to where it started, a straight line back to where it started, unless you stop where you started. And that's important to realize that if if there's something in the middle here, like a building, and you draw around it, you want to make sure you go all the way back to where you started, otherwise it will cut right through your building. And it's kind of hard to explain that, but just make sure when you're drawing, I would always kind of go back to where I started. That way you'll know it selected exactly what you wanted to. From here you have all of the same features like feathering, growing, shrinking, border, hiding. All the features I mentioned in the last command are all available here as well. So that's why I didn't spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time on those 2 commands because you can actually apply those ideas of selecting, shrinking, growing, and things like that. And I'll go to throw this out right now. There's also a distort command here that allows you to select an area, and then it's not going to come up on me. Oh, it's down here in a little separate window. This little window pops up. When you hit OK, it will take your selection and kind of give it a very rough, jagged appearance. So it's probably hard to see. Let me fill that with a color so you can see. So I didn't draw it that jagged, but it actually kind of created that shape. So sometimes you don't want a perfectly selected area. Let me zoom in so you can kind of see. It created all those little jagged lines automatically. So next tool, and I'm not going to use, well, yeah, I do want to use this owl for this next image. This is called either the magic wand tool, or in this program, the fuzzy select tool. It looks like a magic wand, so you can still remember that picture. This will select all the colors that are similar, or actually not, well, it could be similar. I'll explain how that works in a moment. So if I click there, what it's going to do is select all the yellows that are connected together. When I say connected, it means if there happen to be yellow down here, that will not connect with it. It will not select that. Just the yellows, or maybe a better example, the yellows in this eye will not be selected. There is a tool for that, this by color option. If I click here, you'll notice that it did pick up colors in both eyes because this option does not have to be connected to each other, or what they call contiguous. Contiguous means it's connected. The problem here is, if you can see that, it's hard to get an exact color, especially on photographs, because there's so many thousands of colors in this eye. So what you can do is you can change the threshold. The threshold determines how selective or how picky that selection is. So if I increase the threshold and try it again, see how it gets a much larger area of the eye? It kind of stopped where the eye, in the shadow, where it got darker. But all of this, and it didn't get the white because that was too much of a difference in yellow. And if I use the bicolor, let's see if we can get parts of both eyes. So now when I selected it, this option went back to the lower value in the threshold. So let me move that up here. Now if you increase the threshold too much, hopefully you can see that on your screen that I selected all kind of grays and whites as well. So the threshold was really too large. So you don't want that any larger than it has to be. You see it's still getting other shades of color, so I'm going to go down a little more. And eventually, that's very little selected. You can get, and some images are too complex for this tool. You have to use something maybe more manual in selecting the object, the colors, because this one is just too many different shades. And I'm going to give you a perfect tool for that in a moment. So now this is where they're helpful is when you have very obvious changes in colors, like this background here. If I wanted to, paint around the owl, I can just select that green, and it's pretty good at stopping and not going too far in, but getting enough of the greens so that I have one solid area to paint. So that is the a couple terms, either the magic one or the fuzzy select or the select by color tool. Both of those will select colors. The last one is not actually on the toolbar here, but it's a very, very important one I want to mention, and that is up on the select, and it's called a quick mask. The way a quick mask works is when you select that object or that option, it will turn your entire image kind of a red color. And now you're going to use black and white paint. I remember in an earlier video I mentioned that we're not going to just be painting solid colors with this paintbrush. Sometimes we're going to use it to fix things. So when I paint white, I'm removing that red. As you can see, it goes back to the original yellow color. What I'm doing is I'm basically painting my selection. So maybe I couldn't, maybe the area I'm wanting is too complex for any kind of magic wand or lasso, and it's just easier to just paint it in. Now, once you finish painting, just go back and turn that mask off, toggle quick mask, and you'll see that it has created a selection for me. And again, if you want to see exactly, let me just select a color here, what it has selected. If I paint, went back to, there we go. It's going to, it's selecting just the eye, what I painted. So the quick mask is a good way of painting the selection. Some people, and it's really a matter of personal preference, some people prefer to draw an area with their lasso tool. Some people would rather, and you can actually use both. And let me go ahead and select an area and turn on the quick mask. That it's still selected. So it's turned my lasso tool into a quick mask. So, and then from there you can go back to your paintbrush and just modify it. Maybe add a little more. Maybe you want to feather. You can switch to a feathered brush. So now it has a very feathered edge to the selection. So that is the quick mask. Another way of selecting so you can make changes to your image. So I just want you to be aware of these options from the rectangular select, the lasso, the magic wand, by color, and the quick mask. All ways of selecting parts of your image in order to make changes to your image.